Hello and welcome back to the Bird's Eye View podcast. We are here on the morning following the winter meetings. I'm your host, Zach Worden, joined as always by Jori Negin-Shecter. And Jori, as we sit here today, the winter meetings obviously come to a close. A couple signings, some big signings at least. You know, you get Edwin Diaz, Kyle Schwarber, Pete Alonso, and a whole lot of talk, but overall, very little action, I think, from what we've seen from the winter meetings in the past. But nonetheless, how did you enjoy the few days of rumors and speculation and murmurs and all that comes with the baseball world being in one place?
Yes, as you mentioned, the Blue Jays, not their busiest period by any means. We were introduced to Dylan Cease, and of course, the Cody Ponce deal becomes official. But beyond that, it was a lot of murmurs, a lot of whispers. You heard a little bit about Kyle Tucker. Is he even going to hit the $300 million mark? We heard a little bit about the Blue Jays having some interest in Ketel Marte, but it sure sounds like the price tag there is going to be well beyond the Blue Jays' means. So today's episode will be brought to you by the letter R for rumors, because in terms of concrete action, a bit of a quiet one for the Blue Jays at this winter meetings.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that you brought up the Cease thing because that's something that we didn't have on our rundown, but something that did happen. And, I think with him coming in and finally being introduced, you get to learn about the guy a little bit. And, you hear him kind of talk about what brought him to Toronto outside of the $210 million and how, impressed by the facilities and, Scott Boras shouting out Edward Rogers by name. Good stuff there. But I think before we get into, all the rumors and the Rule 5 draft a little bit, of course, for all those Rule 5 sickos, we'll dive into that a little bit. Let's discuss the signings that did happen, kind of the major ones, and maybe how we think that impacts the Blue Jays. And obviously, like I said, it was Schwarber, it was Diaz, it was Alonso, and good news for the Blue Jays, Schwarber and Diaz not in the American League. They stay over in the NL, but bad news. Pete Alonso not only changes leagues, but he arrives in the AL East with the Orioles, and I think we can kind of start with that one.
Yeah, I mean, just another big bopper in the American League East. Uh, the Orioles get their much needed offensive addition, although pitching probably still a priority. Uh, this clearly is a team that wants to be better than they were last year. Now, as far as that affects the Blue Jays, I think that that's probably a bit of you know, how good are the Orioles going to be by adding Pete Alonso? Your guess is as good as mine. Is he a premier hitter? Of course, but in terms of maybe the raw value that he's going to add to this equation, I think maybe that's a bit of a different discussion. Now, with that all being said, obviously you don't love having a guy like that join your division, but no reason to think that the Jays are not going to be answering back in the weeks to come at the very least.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting. Obviously, at this point with the Jays, it's kind of seemingly the Kyle Tucker, the Bo Bichette, maybe the Alex Bregman if they miss out on both of those, and then the relief market where they're kind of gonna make up their ground, or not even make up their ground. Obviously, they're the American League champions for a reason, and returning a very good roster. So we'll kind of see. I am interested to see what's next for the Orioles because it sounds like they are still committed to adding a starter. They've rumored to have been in connection with Framber Valdez. Ranger Suarez is a name that's kind of popped up connected to them. They were connected to Freddie Peralta through trade. So, it certainly seems like the Orioles still have stuff cooking. And this was kind of, I think when the Orioles sold was kind of the fear that they were going to start to pour a little bit more into their roster, right? So if they do that, whether it's Framber, whether it's Ranger Suarez, maybe it's two of those plus a trade when they try to address the rotation, because as things stand right now, they obviously lost Corbin Burns the year before. They lost Grayson Rodriguez in a trade the with the Angels, and then even beyond that, Zach Eflin's a free agent. So as the rotation stands, it's Trevor Rogers, it's Kyle Bradish, it's Dean Kramer, Tyler Wells, and Cade Povich. And of that fivesome there, I think to me, like Bradish is the only one that I would kind of consider to be like a guy who's going to perform really well. Obviously Rogers was great down the stretch, but we'll kind of see. He'd obviously been a middling pitcher, I think is generous to what he had been in kind of the couple years previous. So, going to be really interesting to see like how much they continue to spend on their roster, and I think it just kind of adds to this beast of a division with the Red Sox seemingly being all over the place with their connections. The Rays are going to be better. They're rumored to be connected to Ketel Marte. The Yankees, maybe a little bit more quiet of an offseason coming for them than their fan base would like, but it's still, a really good roster with the best hitter in baseball.
Yeah, I think, if I were to say where the vibe was at, maybe pre-winter meetings as opposed to post-winter meetings, I'd say slight downward trend, I think is probably the way I would describe things. Kyle Tucker doesn't feel like such an, obvious slam dunk Blue Jay at this point. You got teams around you that are adding. It's always the American League East very tough to be a competitive team. And, the hope is that the Jays again returning as quality team that's going to be supplemented by some big additions. I mean, they've already made some big additions, but there's going to be a tough group, I think, to put it lightly, to repeat as American League East champions. And, the way that the winter meetings shook down, they didn't do anything wrong. But, you would have loved some action as opposed to what ultimately we saw, which sounds like it was a lot of handshakes, a lot of nodding heads, a lot of murmurs, a lot of rumors, a lot of whispers, this, that, and the other.
It's funny because, I think going in, we feel like the Blue Jays are the favorites for Cal Tucker, and I would still, consider them to be in that position. And, I actually think the way things unfolded, you don't necessarily hate it, right? Because the Phillies, who were said to be a potential landing spot for Tucker if Schwarber went elsewhere, Schwarber goes back to the Phillies. The Mets haven't really been all that connected to Tucker, right? But, the Orioles were, right? They were a team that seemed to kind of be on the periphery of that conversation when you consider Mike Elias having been one of the guys that drafted Kyle Tucker, and this seemingly takes them out of his market, right? So that's two potential suitors who kind of fall out of it because of the big signings that they do make. And so what does that leave for Tucker now? And it's the Jays, the Mets. You don't really know how they're going to react to losing Alonso and Diaz. You don't know, maybe they have kind of changed their mind on how they feel about Tucker. There's kind of been some mixed reporting on whether they are in the mix there. And the Yankees kind of same thing, right? Like, are they going to go out and spend the money on Kyle Tucker? Like, I had kind of thought that he would be a guy that they would have targeted coming into the offseason, but again, they haven't been connected all that often. And, so, who else are you looking at as a potential Kyle Tucker shooter?
Well, I think you've missed a very obvious one in the Los Angeles Dodgers. They just
Yes,
went out
yes, of
and
course,
acquired
of
Edwin
course.
Diaz. And there was that report from Katie Woo where, maybe they are going to be in the mix on a shorter term, higher AAV deal.
And
Um,
that's where you get scared, I
that
think,
is
right?
frightening.
Because, you mentioned kind of when we started here that Tucker may be his total value may be softening, right? I think it was ESPN's Jesse Rogers who said on a radio show that it was like 250, 300 was kind of where his market may end up landing, right? And if you're Cal Tucker, if you're going to take a $250 million deal over this long term that you've been expecting, why wouldn't you go with like a 3 year, $130 million deal instead?
It makes a lot more sense, and you cash in the way that Alex Bregman is
Yeah.
expected to cash in. But, from the Blue Jays, you can't let it get to that point,
Yeah.
can you?
No, that's like this is where it's if you're the Blue Jays, you have this financial might that you are flexing and that you're trying to to kind of put out there, right? Like if it's Kyle Tucker's like, okay, well, if you're not going to give me $350 million, I'm going to go to the Dodgers for 120 or whatever he's going to take. Then maybe you say, all right, we'll do the $350 million deal to get it done with one of the best 15 hitters in baseball, one of maybe even one of the 10 best hitters in baseball.
Well, it's exactly that, right? I'm very curious why his market is so soft at this stage. Maybe it's just that it's early. Maybe it's that we just haven't heard much in terms of him meeting with teams. It sounds like that's going to come in the
Yeah.
next maybe week or so. But it's certainly surprising to me that it's not in the same category as like the Soto discussion last year. I get that there's an age discrepancy. I get that there's maybe a talent discrepancy, but you know, the talk is like it's a gulf when I'm not sure it's really much more than a chip shot.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think that if you're Tucker, that, you probably end up waiting it out, right? Because you want that like $400 million payday that was seemingly, kind of seemed to be coming for him like at this time last year. And now if you're down 150 million, you're probably going to sit there and kind of wait for, more teams to get desperate, whatever it ends up being, or you're just going to maybe go ahead and take that shorter deal at the end of it because it will be there for you. So we'll kind of see. I mean, it's obviously so tough to like parse through all the rumors and what everybody's saying because everybody's presenting a little bit of different information. And I think it was at the beginning of the winter meetings. Mark Feinsad had said that Tucker had meetings scheduled with teams after the winter meetings after the meetings. There's so many meetings, but um, yeah, it's really interesting. And I, if we're sitting here today, I would probably not be anticipating a resolution anytime soon.
No, it does seem like it'll be probably at minimum Christmas, and I could totally see it stretching into the new year.
Yeah, 100%. Diaz and Schwarber, I mean, the Schwarber stuff, interesting that the Orioles kind of offered the same deal that the Phillies did. I don't think the Schwarber Jays connection was ever really there. The Diaz stuff, of course, the Jays were kind of mentioned in the mix, but at the end of the day, the Dodgers, they go out and they give the biggest deal. I think the Mets were at 366, and if the Blue Jays had given a $30 million AAV to a reliever, I would have been pretty shocked.
It's just not really how they operate. We've seen it repeatedly that they are open to spending in the reliever market, but are not looking to blow the doors off. And Edwin Diaz clearly was going to be a case of the latter. Now, for him to end up with the Dodgers, obviously, is not ideal. Again, not in the American League, so you can take solace in that. But I mean, the Death Star just continues adding pieces and really starting to feel like a lockout is a formality at this point. Maybe I'm a little bit too pessimistic, but I mean, the Jays ultimately don't go out and spend big on Diaz, which, to be fair, I don't know that they were ever really going to be the team that did that, as you said. But it is interesting that Robert Suarez is the name that continues kind of popping up. And it really sounds like that is where the next move is coming. We've heard a lot about the Jays being interested in Suarez. We've heard a lot about a mutual connection there. Heard a lot about the Jays' next move likely coming in the reliever market. The sense that you certainly get is that it's probably going to be a move with Suarez as opposed to that Kyle Tucker move that a lot of Blue Jays fans are undoubtedly really kind of waiting on bated breath with.
Yeah, I think obviously the reliever market has been kind of the fastest moving one, right? Like I think the starting pitching market hasn't really moved at all, and that will come to a forced conclusion eventually with the likes of Tatsuya Mai and kind of some of the international guys being or having to sign by early January. So we'll probably see moves there. Framber, haven't heard a ton there. Um, but the Suarez stuff, yeah, he seems like kind of like the logical one to come off the board next. And, I think he kind of seemed like he would make sense as a fit for the Jays, kind of like shorter term guy because he's a little bit older, has that closing experience that they're looking for. But now I wonder with, some of the teams that were in on Diaz, I think the Braves were in the mix reportedly on Diaz too, and the Mets, if they're going to pivot, like, is there going to be a bidding war for Suarez? Because I would imagine that if there's a bidding war for Suarez, the Blue Jays aren't going to be, you know, going past their valuations to the point that a team like the Mets might to, make a point and land what is in theory one of the top three or four closers that were available this winter.
Yeah, and then it bumps down a ring, and then you're talking about Brad Keller and Luke Weaver, and it becomes a question of, okay, are these guys going to, dethrone Jeff Hoffman from the closer role? I don't know about that, so it becomes a bit of a question of, are they really dead set here on adding a closer, capital C closer, or are they just trying to improve the bullpen? Because to me, those are two different things. And to me, the correct answer to that is to improve the bullpen, not find a closer.
Yes, it's funny how, at the beginning of the offseason, you ask Ross Atkins in a press conference about Jeff Hoffman. He says, "Oh, Jeff Hoffman isn't married to that role." And now at the winter meetings, after Helsley's off the market, after Williams is off the market, I can't remember if Schneider said this before or after Diaz came off. I think it might have been after, but Schneider says, "Oh, we feel very comfortable with Jeff Hoffman as our closer. Like there's nobody I would have rather had on the mound in Game 7, like anything like that, right?" So the messaging there pivots. I could. The Fairbanks thing kind of seems like that would also kind of be a fit for where, you get a guy with some closing experience, a guy with some strikeout stuff, um, who won't be as expensive as Suarez. But, if those two go off the board, then, certainly I believe, Shy and Ben Nicholson Smith at Sportsnet both connected the Jays to Weaver. So is kind of Weaver a natural pivot point from those conversations if teams are, enamored in in those bidding wars. So it'll be interesting to see. I mean, like I know you are kind of in on the Brad Keller conversation, which has been another guy that the Jays have been connected to. Is Keller like to you the one that you want out of the guys who are remaining out there?
I think if it's going to be at that point, I think it would be so foolish to marry yourself to finding a closer when, repeatedly the discussion has been with this team about finding like inefficiencies and finding ways to zig when others zag. And the best way to do that is to go out and get a guy that isn't necessarily a closer and either make them your closer or make them a high leverage arm. Like for the Jays, as things stand, their bullpen obviously isn't perfect, but they've got a lot of the right pieces in place. But you would like to add a really good high leverage guy. And I think there's opportunities to do that with a guy like a Brad Keller, who, by the way, certainly wasn't a high leverage guy when he signed last offseason, right? Like, who's to say that the guy that you find that isn't necessarily a high leverage guy can't be that high leverage guy for you?
Yeah, and maybe they did that today. Maybe they found a high leverage arm. How do you like that pivot point right there?
That's a pretty nice segue.
So
Let's
in
talk about
the
Spencer kilometers, or
in
should I say
the
Spencer miles?
so in the Rule 5 draft today, the Blue Jays, I think, kind of unexpectedly made a pick. They were picking 27th, so certainly not, kind of the pick at the top of the draft. And they go ahead and they pick Spencer Miles from the San Francisco Giants, a 25-year-old right-hander who, can throw in the upper 90s with his fastball. But, the thing with him is that he has very, very, very limited professional experience since being drafted in 2022. I think it's something like 14 career innings, and then he threw 8 in the Arizona Fall League this year. So it's not a large track record, and it is such a bet on stuff. But as the Rule 5 draft goes, you have to keep him on your 26-man roster for the entire year, or else you are subject to losing him back to his original club. So, I mean, for you, like I don't know, we're not going to have groundbreaking Spencer Miles analysis considering this guy has, barely pitched in the majors and is coming off Tommy John. And, we can look at his data from the Arizona Fall League, which, looks pretty good. The Stuff Plus is 107.4, which is a good number, and Stuff Plus can be pretty predictive for reliever ERA even. But, again, this is a guy who hasn't pitched above low A. So, I mean, what was kind of your reaction to them making that pick? And do you have any expectations for what Miles represents for this team?
And oh, by the way, Angel Bastardo, also a guy they'll have to keep on the 26-man roster if they intend to keep him in the organization as well. Yeah. I think compelled, very curious that they did ultimately make a Rule 5 pick. The player, you take it or leave it. It's a reliever. It seems like maybe he'll contribute. He'll get a shot to do so in spring training, and, the Jays will get a better look at him and see exactly kind of what he's working with. obviously the limited professional experience is curious. Um, is that going to leave you in a spot where, he's forced to work as a mop-up guy? Does this affect anything like how Braden Fisher gets utilized, or how a guy like obviously is a lefty, but Mason Fluharty, another guy with options, you wonder how he factors into this. He'll be in that kind of mushy area of guys with maybe upside, maybe not upside. But evidently the Jays felt that there was an opportunity to add a guy that, they felt was big league ready, had big league stuff. Now, you know, is he going to stick with the Jays this year? Right now, I would set, if it was a 50-50, I would say more unlikely than likely that he remains with the Blue Jays. But certainly not impossible that he does ultimately, right? I think that we're really going to learn a lot more about him as the winter progresses. I think as the Jays kind of get him into the system and kind of acclimate him, when pitchers and catchers report in another, 2 months or so, that's when we will really kind of figure out exactly who Spencer Miles is. Because right now, I mean, you and I can talk about the stuff plus numbers. We can talk about, what he's done to this point, but there's just so little data, so little information on him that this is really just a bet on kind of the Jays' internal info.
Yeah, so I mean, very similar to Bastardo, right? Like where he undergoes Tommy John in 2024, misses the entirety of 2025, and then Bastardo, of course, was on the Blue Jays Arizona Fall League roster initially. Had a little bit of a setback, wasn't able to throw. Miles, of course, goes to the Arizona Fall League and throws. One thing that I think is pretty interesting is obviously the fact that they are betting on him being mature enough and ready to pitch in the big leagues, right? And I would imagine a large role in that was Justin Lear, who of course is a big part of the Blue Jays pitching development now, and the guy who kind of oversees their minor league pitching development. And they hired him from the Giants, of course, where you get Spencer Miles from. So I would imagine that there are some makeup reports there, and I certainly would say that that probably gave them confidence to make the pick, and I would very much assume that Lear was a significant part in that conversation. And whether he sticks with the club or not, I mean, we'll see. Obviously, the bullpen now has I think it's like four guys who are essentially use them or lose them at the beginning of the year in Miles, Bastardo, Lauer doesn't have an option, Tommy Nance doesn't have an option. And again, maybe you can kind of slip those guys through waivers for obviously not for Miles and Bastardo, but we'll kind of see how it turns out. I mean, I don't mind the bet, right? Like it really is only money. You get the guy into your program, you look at him, and the Jays have kind of I think it's a way that you can kind of flex your financial might. And even if you look at last year's Rule 5 draft, only three of the 15 guys taken in the MLB portion made it the entire year with their new clubs. And one of those being Bastardo, who of course, didn't even
Didn't
pitch
even pitch.
for the Blue Jays. And, the other two, Shane Smith was an all-star for the White Sox, and the other one was Liam Hicks with the Marlins. So yeah, I think it'll be really interesting. I don't mind the bet. Initially I think you kind of think, oh, that's surprising, but then it's, what is the real risk other than money for them?
Yeah, the risk here, negligible.
Yeah,
Just maybe put a pin in that one. We'll just see if maybe something comes of this. Don't expect anything to, but who knows? Maybe you found your next Joe Biagini.
maybe. Maybe it would be that'd be a good story if he was able to become, something for them next year. I don't think we got to spend much time on the minor league portion of the draft. Hopefully we got some Rule 5 sickos in the chat here because, it's that time of year, but Hedbert Perez and Travis Kuhn are the two guys that the Blue Jays picked there. Hedbert Perez was the number 3 prospect in the Brewers system back in, I believe it was 2021, and things have just not turned out very well for him. He was given 700K to sign as a professional out of Venezuela, and was kind of one of these international guys that the Brewers identified and picked, and the Blue Jays grab him here because his time was up, and he has not played above Double A, and he got his first taste of Double A this past year. And then Kuhn they grabbed from the Tigers, guy who was released midseason by the Phillies, signed with the Tigers, and he pitched better with Detroit from a run prevention standpoint, but the strikeouts were down. So it'll be interesting kind of what they identified with him. He's 27, so we'll be of course watching to see both where those guys start and kind of how they fit in.
Again,
You
seeing Zach what's
got
to come, I think you've basically summarized exactly what there is to say about Hedbert Perez and Travis Kuhn. And we skimmed through the minor league portion of the Rule 5 draft just before we hit the record button, and um, not a lot of names to pick out. I think the standout that I found was Alejandro de Aza. So, the bar is set for can they become the best minor league Rule 5 choice of all time, because the expectations there are, shall we say, negligible.
Hedbert Perez's dad, Robert. 144 games of big league experience with the Blue Jays from 1994 to 1997 before spending time with Seattle, Montreal, the Yankees, and the Brewers. So, they do love their big league sons. I guess we can put Hedbert Perez into the Vladdy, Bo, Will Wagner, Cavan Biggio group of Blue Jays, I
Of
suppose.
legacy guys, of Dalton Varsho and
Dalton
all of
Varsho,
those
of course,
dudes.
yeah. But yeah, I don't really have much else on the minor league portion. I am a Rule 5 enjoyer. I will say I do kind of just like the idea of it. Penango obviously stays with the Blue Jays. He was kind of rumored before that there was a chance that he would go, and you and I had kind of gone back and forth on whether we thought he was going to. I thought probably that he might, just given some of the baited ball or the batted ball data, but of course, some of the positional stuff, the fact that the results actually weren't there, the fact that he's, a little bit more of a plotter than a speedster. I think if you're the Blue Jays, you're happy to keep him.
Stays in your org, nothing lost, and you hope that the batted ball metrics, he turns into a big leaguer. This episode of the Bird's Eye View podcast is brought to you by BioSteel. Use code Bird's Eye View at checkout for 20% off your order at biosteel.ca. Again, that's code Bird's Eye View at checkout for 20% off your order. For all your high performance hydration needs, visit biosteel.ca. Thank you again to BioSteel for sponsoring today's episode.
I want to touch on some of the WBC stuff that was said with general manager Greg Hamilton and manager Ernie Witt, but before we kind of move on to Canada and the WBC, you got any other thoughts on Jay's stuff from these winter meetings? Whether it's Bo apparently meeting with the Red Sox over Zoom, whether it's Shine Ben writing today that the Bassett and Scherzer reunions are unlikely but not impossible. Again, it's a lot of talk, but not a lot of tangible action. But I mean, you got any thoughts on either of those things?
I think the bow thing is a little bit interesting. I don't know if there's much meat on the bone on that one. It sounds like, again, like as with most stuff around this time of year, it's a lot of development, not a lot of action per se. Do think it's interesting that the Red Sox have checked in, but on that note, I think that it's still a little bit early. It really feels like the bow market will probably reach its kind of full-fledged kind of version of itself after the Tucker stuff is ultimately
Yeah,
decided. And, to that end, I think it's almost like too early to read into the Bo meeting with the Red Sox stuff. We knew that he would be kind of meeting around. I do think it's interesting that a couple of teams apparently do have him as a shortstop.
yeah.
I don't think that a lot of teams, a lot of smart teams view him that way, but perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps there's an opportunity for him to improve defensively. I think that would be a bit of a unique circumstance. But as far as the bow market goes, there's some news, but nothing really too concrete, which might just be the theme of this episode.
Maybe, maybe. Yeah, I think you're right that he's kind of waiting for Tucker and waiting for Bregman to a certain extent, right? It sounds like the Red Sox priority is Bregman and, how whatever they want to do there. It seems like the Red Sox are maybe not willing to commit a ton of years to these guys, and maybe they'd be willing to go more years with Bo because he's still in his 20s compared to, Alonso and Bregman who are a little bit longer in the tooth. But yeah, I think we are going to have to wait for Bo's market just to kind of see what plays out with the Jays and what plays out with everybody else. But Let's move on to the World Baseball Classic stuff here. Obviously, that time of year is coming. We just had our conversation with Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame director Scott Crawford, and we talked a little bit about WBC, but nice to actually hear from Greg Hamilton and Ernie Witt and get some tangible news. It sounds like the interest is certainly there from a bunch of players and. Um, I think kind of what we expected, right? That they were going to get a large commitment from the position player group, but maybe have a little bit of trouble on the pitching side. I think, it sounds like Freddie Freeman again wants to play, but is dealing with injury. So we'll kind of see what happens with him there. The Naylor brothers, I believe, are both, if not committed, very, very interested in playing. And then, you've kind of got that young core that they had in 23 in Clark, Toro, Otto Lopez, Eddie Julian, Owen Casey. I think the only like ones that I've seen of like firm commitments have been Casey and Lopez, but um, certainly nice to have kind of that position player core fired up and ready to go.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, not to be a negative Nancy here, but I think that the interesting thing here is the pitching front for sure. It does sound like a potential staff ace in Nick Pivetta is not going to happen, which is a pretty substantial blow, but I don't know if that was ever going to happen at the end of the day. Um,
He just threw so much this last year, and
yeah, it kind of didn't seem like it was in the cards, but it's going to be very interesting, to me, exactly how they're able to put this team together. Still a lot of question marks, a lot of stuff to be answered. We're hearing a lot about, the U.S. is putting together the Avengers. Team
they
Canada can't do that per se, but they can put together a really competitive roster if they ultimately field the best version of their team. And, I wonder how close to that team they are going to get.
Yeah, I think, it sounded, Greg Hamilton, it sounded like he was kind of, beating the drum of our entire position player core could be major leaguers, which, again, if you go around the diamond, right, you feel good about having Bo Naylor behind the plate, Freddie Freeman at first, Eddie Julian at second, Otto Lopez at short, Abraham Toro at third, and then, your outfield is like Casey, Denzel Clark, Tyler O'Neill. And, I'm sure I'm forgetting. So Josh Naylor, he, is kind of in the mix there as well. So we'll, hopefully you get all the commitment from those guys and um you kind of maybe are able to out hit some teams, but on the pitching side, you mentioned Pivetta already seeming being a little bit unlikely. It sounds like the bullpen is kind of going to be in a good spot from what they said with Eric Sabrowski and Kate Smith both from the Guardians being on board with Matt Brash. I believe they said that he's committed to play, which will be nice to kind of have that trio of big league guys. And then Jonah Tong they said is interested, but is that a guy who's going to get the green light? I feel that a guy competing for a spot in big league spring training with the Mets, it would be a tough sell for him to leave for a few weeks to go to Puerto Rico and train with Team Canada because their training camp is going to be held alongside the Blue Jays in Dunedin. So from the pitching front, I guess the other kind of notable thing that was said was that James Paxton is a guy that they are kind of exploring. Obviously, who's retired, but
Hasn't stopped them
it's
before.
hasn't stopped them before. That is a great point because last time they had John Axford, Adam Lowen, Andrew Albers, a bunch of guys who did pitch in the big leagues, but
In the
had
twilight.
had retired. Twilight is a great way to put it. We're in the twilight of their careers, so would be cool to see Big Maple suit up for them in Puerto Rico.
Yeah, I think that would be a fun one. We'll see how that kind of shakes out. The World Baseball Classic stuff, I think it'll become a little bit more kind of real as January rolls around. I know we both plan on being very kind of active on that front as far as coverage. Um, I think that'll be a lot of fun to see how this roster ultimately does kind of come together, how everybody kind of fits in with that puzzle piece. The pitching, like you said, is going to be really interesting, but if the starters are good enough, if they can just kind of bridge the gap to the rest of the bullpen and the rest of that group, and again, we will have a full World Baseball Classic preview in the weeks to come. But this is a Canada team that is certainly capable of doing stuff. I don't know what, but they're capable of doing stuff when it comes to at least Puerto Rico and hopefully beyond.
Yeah, I think the obviously, we're just such in such early stages with the roster reporting and everything like that. The analysis at this point is fingers crossed that they're able to get everybody that they can there. Another, I think they said Romano, that there was interest on both sides. Of course, Romano, who has pitched for Italy in the past, or is committed to Italy for this event in the past, would be nice for him to be on the team. But once again, free agent, who knows where he lands, how that all develops. So we'll kind of see there. Would be a really interesting kind of if George Springer plays for Puerto Rico in this event, because it sounds like he's on their preliminary roster. So you watch Team Canada against George Springer and Puerto Rico. That could be, Jose Barrios as well, kind of in that mix. But lots of fun news World Baseball Classic wise, and like you said, yeah, we'll be kind of all over, covering that as we get closer. But it is tough to say too much other than get as many guys as you can there, and hopefully it unfolds well.
Yeah, the news is just trickling out, but I think we'll learn lots in the next, call it 6 weeks.
That's a good time frame. Anything else for you from these winter meetings? There, a lot of good stuff. Anything from the Cease presser, anything from Ross Atkins on MLB Network Radio, on MLB Network The Set, anything that stood out to you that we didn't touch to, any specific rumors that intrigue you?
I think it's we we've covered our bases pretty well here. Definitely intrigued by Cease the character. Got the opportunity to watch his sit down with Hazel May, and obviously saw the quotes about him wanting to be a Blue Jay. I think that at the end of the day, uh, not the most exciting winter meetings from the Blue Jays' perspective. Maybe not the most productive, but you hope that the way things shook out, that you're walking out of there feeling comfortable with where you are as an organization. Is that the case? I guess we'll see, but we'll see how the rest of the winter ultimately plays out.
Yeah. Well, good stuff. Appreciate you taking the time to jump on, even though we, didn't have any actual news to discuss about, or anything, major significant. But I think a good check-in after winter meetings. A couple of things happen with the Jays, and gonna be interesting to see how things unfold in the coming days, weeks, and months, because it could pick up at any time. I think you look at the rumors coming out of there, and of course, you're watching all the big names. The Scooble stuff is all interesting, but you never know what's going to happen until it does. And we're kind of back into that time of year where you're not going to be glued to your phone 24/7, and it's going to be kind of, it's like a bomb dropping, right? Like you just never know. And that Jeff Passan breaking tweet when it comes in, it's almost a little bit more fun to me when it's out of the blue, rather than you're sitting there during the winter meetings and like, come on, let's do something. You know what I mean? But yeah, appreciate it, and we'll chat again, I guess, sometime soon, hopefully when there's news.
Yes, I'm sure there will be news in the days to come. But for now, we'll call this one a bit of a rumor roundup, if you will.
All right. That is going to do it for us here today at the Bird's Eye View podcast. Make sure to hit the subscribe and like buttons if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening along on the audio provider of your choice, make sure to drop a follow and review. You can follow us all on Twitter. I am at Worden_Zach. Jori is at Jori Negin-Shecter. And the pod is at BEV_pod. Thank you so much for listening.